welcome to the Earth Feels podcast.
I'm Rose.
And I'm Christine.
Welcome to Earth Feels, the podcast for people feeling overwhelmed by the endlessly gloomy climate news.
Where every week we have soul-based conversations about climate change and explore the idea that climate change may be happening for us as much as it is happening to us.
If you are ready to shift your focus and secure the future for our kids and our grandkids, then this is the podcast for you.
And yes, we do know how to spell. Welcome to episode 39 of Earth Feels. I'm so glad you've joined us. It's Christine. I'm going to be your host today. Rose is away. And in this episode, we're going to explore what the Indigenous relationship with the land can teach the rest of us in a time of climate emergency. To help shed some light on that, my friend Kaaren Dannenmann, who brings an Indigenous perspective to this question, is going to join us. So let's get started. This is my wise and beautiful friend, Kaaren Dannenmann, who is back because we had a wonderful conversation yesterday. It was so great to hear her talk about the Indigenous relationship to the land and her own experience. And my bad. My technology failed entirely, and so we have to re-record it. And she is a good enough friend and a good enough person that she made time in her busy schedule before she leaves for Thunder Bay tomorrow, which is an 8-hour drive, to come and do it all over again. So Kaaren is a mother of 3, grandma or kukum to 5. And she's from Trout Lake, and she's Anishinaabe. So what else can I say about you? There's a lot, but do you want to add anything to that introduction?
Bonjour. Mexico Indigenous, na Mexican Gendonchi, a Tekamekan to them. So I just introduced myself with my ceremonial name, told you where I was from, and also what my clan is.
Thank you for that. So that is Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe.
Anishinaabe. And Anishinaabe means the people. Is that right?
Yes.
And that is what the Indigenous people of, is it Northern Ontario or all of Ontario, or like how would you describe it, or this part of Ontario and into Minnesota, or where are the Anishinaabe?
They go all the way down to Toronto area, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, as far west as Winnipeg, and east as far as Ottawa. And
of course, they've been here since time before memory. That's a phrase that I learned from you.
That's a phrase I use.
Yes. And so this week earlier, I recorded an article about the Wet'suwet'en and their claim to oppose the pipeline on their traditional territories. And I thought it would be wonderful if you could make time. I didn't expect you to have to make 2 times to come and talk about Indigenous people of Turtle Island, which is an Indigenous name for what is now North America, Canada and the United States. Experience on Turtle Island of land or relations or, I don't know, climate change. I'm kind of just opening it up to you. And so what would you like to say?
I guess what I like talking about most is relationship to the land, and to us as Anishinaabe, and I know other Indigenous peoples around the world also look at the land as our mother, that the land is not something we just use and build on and develop, and buy and sell, that the land is our mother, and we have to treat her with the same respect and gentleness and kindness that we show our human mother, and to love her and take care of her like that. For us, that relationship is the most important thing, and it's what governs the way we are on the land, the way we think, the way we be on this planet, and how to live with all our other relations on the planet, like the trees and the birds and the animals, the fish, the insects, the grass, the rocks, etc., are all our relations, and we have to learn to live with them and to have that sacred and reciprocal relationship ongoing. And that's what we have to learn about and what we teach our children and grandchildren and each other.
And so when you look around and you see what the dominant culture, what Canada, what the Ontario government, and sort of the powers that be industry, you know, in the example of the Wet'suwet'en, we're talking about Coastal Gas Link, are putting in a natural gas pipeline. What do you think is missing there? It is that sense of the sacred and that connectedness. Would you agree?
Yes, for sure. Yes, and it reminds me of our experiences here in Red Lake and in Trout Lake, where I come from, in the past 100 years. 100 years ago, my mom and her parents and grandparents lived on the land here, and they paddled and carried on their migratory way of life every year according to the seasons. And they were able to do that until gold was discovered here in Red Lake, and then everything changed. And today, we're still fighting to defend this land from whatever that gold production entails and all the corresponding industries that are required to do that.
Yeah, I mean, there's tunnels underground, a kilometer underground here below where we're sitting right now. They've hollowed out for the gold mine. Red Lake has since that discovery has had however many gold mines, and there's still a very active one now. So that's going on, and there's also the logging that happens up a little bit north of us. And so there's definitely this mentality that there are resources that are there to be extracted. And so and here we are in the brink of or in the middle of a climate crisis, a climate emergency. Our water is more and more polluted, our air is polluted, and it's extended even to the atmosphere, and it's affecting our weather systems. And so when you look at that, I mean, it's at some level, it must be heartbreaking for you, because you know that there's a different way of being on the land that is just a knowing that you grew up with. Would you?
Yes, definitely. When just seeing what's happening to the land here, like when I see things being blasted, that hurts, because I know it's hurting our mother. And but I also know that it's up to us. We have a responsibility to take care of the land and to make sure that the land is here for future generations. We're supposed to think about, when we make decisions, what we do during our lifetime here. We have to think in terms of 7 generations from now. And I don't see that happening, except that industry maybe looking 7 generations from now, seeing how big their bank account is or can be.
Yeah, I think they're looking like for the next quarter, usually, like maybe next year and 5 years. But yeah, you're right. They're really missing that 7 generations kind of perspective. We wouldn't be doing what we were doing if that was the case, because we already know here in 2020 that fossil fuels have to be kept in the ground. We are just pushing our mother to the brink, and there's just such a lack of balance in what we're doing. And so when you look at the situation, Kaaren, do you have hope, or what would you say to our listeners who are also feeling grief and sadness?
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes, a lot of grief we feel, sadness, and a lot of times feeling really helpless. Mm-hmm. But I do have hope, and I see that when I see people's willingness and the courage that it takes to do the things that people are doing right now in the blockades and protest marches all over Canada. And it's pretty amazing how widely that's being carried out and how effective that is as a teaching tool. And for a lot of people, it is an opportunity to teach. And so I think that the more people learn another perspective, another way of being on this planet, that we can make a informed consent and making informed choices about how to be on this land, on this planet.
And so would you say now we're making uninformed choices?
I think we have been. We've just been following what we need, what we might need economically, because that seems to be what's driving everything, is that part of the of our needs. Mm-hmm. We've been ignoring our spiritual needs, emotional needs, our psychological needs, and looking at our physical needs, and then also ignoring cultural, social, and our own leadership needs in favor of economic needs.
And it's like that's the only thing we think about.
Yeah.
Or what is it, GDP?
Yes.
Instead of people are starting to talk, and I think the Kingdom of Bhutan has adopted the gross national happiness, I think is a measure, instead of
wow.
GDP. Yeah, gross domestic product.
I think that's good.
Yeah. So wouldn't that be a shift? And that's what you're
Yes.
talking about. It's
Yes.
time to move. And when as you were talking, Kaaren, I was hearing echoes of the medicine wheel. I think that's what you were thinking.
Yes.
Yeah. And so do you want to talk a little bit about the medicine wheel?
Well, the thing that I want to mention that we haven't yet is the language that we use. And so a lot of times, especially dealing with MNR, which is the Ministry of Natural Resources here in Ontario, but they always talk about natural resources, and we try to educate them and saying, but no, you're talking about our mother, the land, and you're talking about all our relations. The moose is a relation, not a resource. The fish are a relation, not a resource. The trees are all relations. All those nations of trees out there, they're nations of trees. And when we start thinking of life from that perspective and not as a resource, we can start living in a more respectful way with those relations instead of thinking them as a way of accumulating wealth personally. So I think that because ultimately the words we use are words that will reinforce the way we see the world, but also the way we see the world dictates the words that we use.
So it's interconnected.
Yes, it's all interconnected.
That is beautiful. And I just wanted to talk about that a little bit more, because when you say the moose is a relation, it doesn't mean that as an Indigenous person you don't eat moose meat, or I've got beautiful earrings that you made for me from I believe it was moose bone, or was it? I'm not wearing them right now, but
caribou.
Caribou. Oh my goodness, even more special. And so, do you want to talk a little bit about the fact that you still eat meat? And
So a part of the sacred relationship is the reciprocity that takes place. And that means for us, the animals are willing to give their lives to us so that we can eat or have clothing, we can have warmth. But the question is, how do we give back to that? Mm-hmm. And so that's what our ceremonies are about. It's about showing that gratitude, that appreciation of those gifts. And that's another word that we use. We say gifts. We have gifts from these relations. We don't call them products. So the moccasins that I wear is a gift from the moose. There's beaver trim on it, so it's also a gift from the beaver. And there were trees that we used for the tanning of the moose hide. So it's a gift from those trees as well, and a gift from the fire giver, for the life giver, fire.
Boy, that is so different than the consumer mindset that's out there now.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I find interesting is that back in the old days, that we always knew the story of all the things around us. We knew the story of each one of these gifts that we were given. For example, with my moccasins, I know who killed the moose. I know who tanned the moose hide. I know who cut up that moose hide and sewed it together so I could have moccasins on my feet. And so all our things had stories to it, which goes with our culture in that every one of our relations has a story for us, and those stories are teachings.
Just as you're talking, I sort of get a glimpse from my Western settler perspective of the sacredness of life, when that's how you can perceive it and feel connected to all our relations, as you say. And I mean, science is finally catching up to the Indigenous worldview and telling us that trees talk to each other. Yes. And there's all of these things that are just coming to light. And you and I both are interested in energy work, and we both are trained in EFT tapping. And that's another way where we realize that we're all connected in ways that our Western mindset, my Western mindset, or the settler culture just doesn't recognize or acknowledge how connected we are. And so would you say that maybe in a way that also is hopeful, because as people change, and your sense is that people are sort of being interested in change, like from the MNR,
yes.
or what do you think?
Yeah, definitely. Even in my own lifetime, even in the last half of my life, I've really seen change happening. And the MNR used to be my enemy. And that I saw that in the numbers of times that I got charged for things like hunting moose or building a cabin. And but now we're meeting regularly so that we can talk about stewardship of the land, and specifically about Trout Lake, so that we can, for us, it's about maintaining its sacredness and sacred integrity, and also keeping it open for Anishinaabe to come back home.
Mm-hmm. Well, we haven't talked about the fact that you got charged and taken to court by the MNR for building a cabin on your traditional territory.
Yeah.
And in the end, you represented yourself.
Yes, I did.
And what was the outcome of that? Because it was sort of, the judge kind of left the door open.
Yeah, it was a long trial, 3 days, and then it took him 6 months to make a decision.
Wow.
And then it took him 6 more months to decide what my sentence would be. And so in the end, I did get convicted, and I got fined $7,500. And the judge, it was a justice of peace, actually.
Okay.
He asked me to come and see him afterwards, and we could talk about how I could pay the fine.
Okay, and just to clarify, you were charged with
Building a cabin without the authority of a work permit.
Okay, so you were found guilty.
I was found guilty. But when I did go talk to him, I thanked him. I thanked him profusely for for the fine. I said, not one penny of that is going to be paid by Anishinaabe. I said, it's going to be white people that pay my fine, and it's going to be because they're learning. I'm going to be teaching them, and they're going to make donations towards, and that's the way it happened for 2 years. And then another woman was charged at the same time as I, and she took her case all the way to the Supreme Court of Ontario, and she won. So that meant that Anishinaabe in their treaty area didn't have to get a work permit.
Which, again, having just reviewed Aboriginal title in the podcast that I just read, it's clear that the country of Canada, the nation of Canada, and the provinces have to respect the law and the inherent right that predates the establishment of Canada.
Yes.
But I guess we're just kind of slow. Well, and because we've gotten away with it. Certainly in British Columbia, where the Wet'suwet'en is, from 1860 on, the provincial government just, even though there wasn't any foundation in British law, because it was still a British colony at the time, began. In 1860?
Well, it was never under treaty, so there was no...
Exactly.
So there was no right to be colonized.
Exactly. I mean, and even under treaty, theoretically, doesn't give the Canadian or the whichever provincial government the right to override Aboriginal rights.
Right.
It's an agreement between sovereign nations.
Yeah.
So the good news is, here in Ontario, there's progress being made.
There is, yes. And in my own case, MNR always says they won, and I always say I won. So we can joke about that now.
You and the MNR?
Yes. Yeah.
Well, and isn't that the way, though? It's the Indigenous way than the settler way, that there is a win-win for everybody.
Yeah.
It's not always competition. I know I've been quoting somebody called Charles Eisenstein recently, and he talks about how the predominant values in Western culture and settler culture, whatever you want to talk about, are money and war. And in those ways of thinking, in that outlook, somebody always loses. Mm-hmm. But there is a different way of looking at the world, is what I hear you saying today.
Yeah.
And the rest of us better listen up and learn. So is there anything else before we sign off for this time? I think we should have Kaaren back again.
Well, I feel I've been really eclectic in my talking today, and but no, the basic thing for me that I want people to understand is it's about relationships. It's about that sacred relationship to the land where we live, and that relationship includes our responsibilities, and we have to know what those are.
Mm-hmm. And so if there was an action step for our listeners, what would you tell them? Because we always like to give them some good news and an action step and a sanity tip. So
wow, okay. Geez, I'd have a long list.
I know. Pare it down to one. Well, I know in our last conversation we talked about how it would be a good idea if people became aware of the land that they are on.
Yes, that would be great. So one of the things that a lot of people are doing all over the world now is that when they visit another part of the world, they do research about the place where they're going and find out whose traditional land that is, and then they try to find out what the story is and how it came to be the situation it is now. And so I would really like people to start looking into the story of how they came to be wherever they are. If it's in Canada, how did your family come to be where you are right now? And maybe look into where did your family come from? Which part of the world did they come from? And I think that information is valuable in terms of self.
And so should people sort of look into whose traditional territory they're on, wherever they are in the world?
Yeah.
And if, say, you came from, like, your dad came from Norway.
Yes.
And you have visited Norway and found out some of the story of the Sami people?
Yes. So, yes, my mother is from Trout Lake, Namekusiping, and my dad was the first white man to come and live there, and they got together somehow.
That's quite a story in itself. Neither of them spoke the other's language.
Yes. But I was in my 50s already when I did go to Norway, and that was the first opportunity I had. And so it was important for me to look into whose traditional land that was. And I found lots of stories about the Sami people and how they were pushed further and further north. And so that was important for me to find out, and it also gave me a sense of responsibility to support the Sami people in whatever struggles they're going through right now.
And so I think that's a lovely action tip for our listeners to look into the land that they're on now and whose ancestral territory it is, or traditional territory, and also look back at your roots. All right, well, that sounds like some homework.
Okay.
Does it?
Yeah,
and we'll have to have you
good.
back so you can give us more. Miigwech.
That's
you.
this week's episode of Earth
Thanks
Feels.
for listening.
Special thanks to singer-songwriter Kristen Hoffman for generously allowing us to use Song for the Ocean. Thanks for listening.
Don't forget, subscribe to our podcast so you don't miss an episode. Catch you next time.
Bye-bye.
Children of the earth, I'm calling out. There's a mission for you and for me. You see, your mother, she has been suffering, and the truth is told beneath the sea. So raise your